Can you have unrest in one place in the world and just rely on it staying there, Jane?
Well, let's look at, again, at the District of Columbia as a symbol or a symptom of what's going on. We talked about pro-democracy movements and how the U.S. picks and chooses. Let's look at what happened with Latin America in the last century, okay? The U.S. picked and chose and extracted all the resources it could from many places. Who do you have when you walk the streets of D.C. as the diaspora, as the population that was displaced by U.S. imperialistic endeavors in Salvador, Guatemala? You have a Hispanic population, a Latino population that's bereft of any resources, that cannot return because of gang wars. What we did was pillage these countries, and now we say, and it was in the guise of pro-democracy movements there with Somoza in Nicaragua. Now we have the FMLN and the FSLN hoping to sort of right the wrongs that are in these countries, but we have to look at what the U.S. had done there and hope that they won't continue to do that in the Arab world or other places. So in terms of talking about unrest with Chavez and stuff, we have to look at the Bolivarist movement in Latin America and support it as self-determination efforts in the face of U.S. imperialism.
When people ask me about immigration who are not Latinos, I always say, use this simple rule. We're here because you were there. And it starts in 1898 with the war with Spain and continues to this day. But on the other hand, if you look up and down the hemisphere, there are now elected governments in many of these countries. And I think, though it took a long time, granted,
despite
and
US
a lot
efforts,
of blood was spilled and a lot of suffering exacted, things are generally headed in a positive direction at long last. But history doesn't turn on a dime, and maybe it'll take a long time for the Arab world to see the same kind of thing that we're seeing in Latin America.
You know, I think the Arab world right now is seeing, in an incredibly condensed time period, what took almost a century in Latin America. I think the biggest, clearest parallel to the Arab Spring, which is, we should note, not only Arab, it's certainly North Africa, but it's also sub-Saharan Africa now. You're seeing risings in Djibouti, in several other African countries. There have been the beginnings of these kinds of stirring of young people, urban people, again, very similar to what has happened in the Arab world. And I think if we look at Latin America, where in the early part of the 20th century, and then right up until the 1980s, 1990s, you had across the continent, still, if we look at particularly the Southern Cone, for instance, you had military dictators of one sort or another, almost all of them backed and armed by the United States, and then you had a democratization process in those countries that brought varying governments to power. Some of them were not politically very different, but they were elected rather than imposed in power. And then it took another 20 years for most of them to be relatively progressive in their political aspects and
to leave office at the end of their term and give way to an elected leader to take their place, which is a big deal.
It's a very big deal. And an economic system that it's not all great, but most of it is headed in, I think, a pretty positive direction from the kind of center-left governments like Brazil or Argentina to the further left like Bolivia and Venezuela. You have a range of progressive thinking, but it came over a very long period with also great cost because of a host of reasons, which includes but isn't limited to communications technology and the rise of pan-Arab media like Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, and others that create for a region a sense of collaboration, a sense of participation, a sense of consciousness of oneness of what's possible. You have it in the Arab world right now in this incredibly squeezed time frame.
Well, and one quick point, it was interesting that the Chinese government suppressed images from Cairo on Chinese television.
Absolutely.
Apparently, people understand that these kinds of things are contagious.
Indeed.